Fine. What are we even filming here today?
It's called Hitachi, Action for a Sustainable Future. Should we move on?
Now this is action.
Actually, the action we're taking here is to efficiently connect wind farms to millions of homes and businesses.
What's happening?
Our robotic systems are building batteries for electric school buses.
Sounds evil. Bad guys there.
No, Gen AI and cloud storage. We've achieved 96% less CO2.
Oh. You go on without me.
Let's go on together, shall we? Only by taking action together can we achieve a sustainable future.
You mean save the world?
You said it.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the panel discussion we're about to have called Scoping Out CO2 Emissions, Collaborative Approaches to Reduce the Comprehensive Carbon Footprint. I am Josh Reddig. I'm a managing director at RMI, an independent nonprofit organization based in Boulder, Colorado, working to further the energy transition. The work that I do at RMI largely focuses on transforming climate-related data into actionable insights, market incentives, and scalable tools that further and advance a safe climate future. Over the past several years, we've witnessed a groundswell of climate ambition from corporate leaders all around the world, with one thing that is starting to come into focus, and that is target setting alone will not bend the planet's climate trajectory. These commitments only become material if they're followed by bold, innovative, and collaborative actions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the near and long term in line with these promises. Thankfully, we have three such bold leaders today with us here and organizations that are actively working to close the ambition to action gap and are utilizing advanced technology and data to drive measurable progress while addressing key societal challenges. Our discussion today will examine strategies for managing Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as how these companies are leveraging innovative and advanced tools and technologies to accelerate that path to impact. And finally, we're going to explore how the central theme of strategic collaboration with customers, with partners, with critical stakeholders, all key for working together are really helping unlock the opportunities and potential here and drive outcomes and win-win results. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to welcome and introduce Andreas Schierenbeck, the CEO of Hitachi Energy, to the stage to provide some opening remarks.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks for the introduction. Welcome to joining us at the session, and let's talk a little bit about scoping out CO2 emissions. We are at Climate Week, so I probably don't have to spend too many words why we should reduce CO2 emissions. I think that's an obvious goal. But saying that we want to reduce CO2 emissions is maybe easier thought than done. Yes, of course, we have big plans in all the nations and all the industries how to do that. Long-term plans, 2030, 2035, 2050, and so on. So we all agree we have to reduce CO2 emissions. And of course, reducing CO2 emissions means that has an impact on our life, on our way we are doing business, how we produce things, how we work, how we collaborate, because actually CO2 emissions we can find nearly in everything what we are doing in our daily routine, if work or at home. On the other hand, if you're talking about CO2 emissions, a main part of that is coming from electricity generation, electricity usage. All the grids, all the energy systems in the world have a kind of CO2 intensiveness. And reducing that is one thing, but on the other hand, we have to look at the energy security. We all used to that electricity is just coming out of the plug. It's there 100% of the time, every day, every minute, every second. But on the other hand, if you're missing it only for a short moment of time or for a longer period of time, you know what it means to have no electricity. And security and safety of energy supply is definitely one thing we should keep in mind. Of course, if you want to decarbonize, you start with electricity generation, getting rid of coal, getting away from hydrocarbons. It's one of the goals we are discussing. But building up more renewables is a good thing. On the other hand, renewables coming cheap, that's fine. They are much cheaper than any other generation source at the moment, but they are volatile. If the sun is not shining, if the wind is not blowing, there is definitely a kind of complexity. And on the other hand, there is something completely new. Normally, we used in our industry to build generation assets where was a demand. You have a big industrial plant, a big city, you build the generation assets there. With renewables, this is not so easy. Offshore wind is offshore. So it's far away. So we have to deal with that complexity as well. So volatility and location is something completely new. On the other hand, let's take a segue. If you talk about decarbonization, I think the name of the game will be electrification. 80% of what we are doing, which is CO2 intense, can be electrified. Good buses, cars, mobility, trams, street cars. A lot of industrial processes which are using steam or other things, you can electrify it. It requires investment, and of course that is done. On the other hand, it generates a demand for electricity. So we need more green electrons going forward than less. So on the one hand, we are trying to get rid of all the gray and black electrons and building new green electrons in the way. On the other hand, we need much, much more. Because if you look at the energy footprint of any state, nation, and so on, it's not only electricity which is driving that, it's as well as the primary energy. So the carbons you're importing, coal, oil, gas, and you have to replace them with electricity coming from renewables. So actually we're increasing demand exponentially. On the other hand, we have to face the fact that only 80% of our processes can be electrified. 20% needs energy in form of molecules. And the production of jet fuel, for instance, all processes which are needing high heat or pharmaceutical processes, they need hydrogen, for instance, there we need green molecules. So actually to decarbonize, what we are doing requires green electrons and green molecules in a conjunction. And that's what we are doing, but of course it definitely demands change from everything what we are doing. As a society and work and a private life, it means change, changing industrial processes, changing the way we are driving around, how we are using energy, dealing with volatility. That's definitely done and it's driven by policy, regulation, because most of the areas I just discussed are regulated. Building a power plant, doesn't matter if it's offshore or onshore, needs regulator approval, needs planning. It's affecting communities. Stringing power lines is not the easiest way to deal with things. Every city has special regulations. And if you just look at the time frame, investing into electricity generation, power lines, and all these things normally takes about 8 years. 5 to 6 years of planning and approvals after you got the funds from the regulator, and 3 years to building it. So the way how we are dealing with this change is very time intensive, and there are a lot of stakeholders. It's changing our business models as well, because the forecasting of things, how we are building it, how we are doing it, is changing. Here as well, driving down CO2 is the name of the game, but it is a complex process for society and all stakeholders. Of course, there's technology involved, which is the good news, because if you have the help of technology, you can deal with the volatility with these processes. Just a practical example, since I have some solar panels on my rooftop, I'm looking very, very accurate when it would be good to use some electricity and when not. It doesn't change really the world, but it has a small impact on CO2 emissions. And it drives continuous innovation. At the moment, we are seeing the impact of reducing the CO2 carbon footprint in a way on energy generation and energy transmission, so on the top of our industry. This will trickle down in the next couple of years to the distribution level as well. Charging buses is distribution level. Using solar energy on a normal distribution level in cities is definitely distribution as well. So here, innovation and data usage, IT, OT is becoming even more powerful, because you should know, if you're running a city, when your buses could be charged and when and where's the energy coming from, forecasting it, running optimizations for your energy footprint, which is a lot of change for everybody involved. So the digital enabled services are becoming more and more powerful, because if you put in as one of the goals reducing CO2, innovation and these services can really be a game changer. How you optimize your city, the normal routines of garbage collection, of public transportation, of running schools, heating, air conditioning, and all these things is definitely something you can do if you have the right focus. Well, and of course it requires talents. We need people to doing that. In the US alone, every year 10,000 electricians are retiring. And the US is only putting 6,000 to 7,000 back. So you have a gap of 3,000 electricians. And this is in other industries the same thing. So looking at the people, at the talents, how to drive that, and how we cope with this shortage of talent is a complete different thing. Furthermore, in the industry of electricity provision as a utility, you have a complex dilemma at hand. Yes, you want to reduce CO2, that's sustainability. How you generate energy, heat, and other things has to be CO2 free. On the other hand, it has to be safe and secure. It's easy to say that you only produce energy if the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, but what happens if that is not the case? In most of the regions, you have 4 to 6 weeks of no sun and no wind. And what happens if other things are coming to light, like international problems? Energy can be a weapon as well. Energy is always political. And the third one, affordability. There is no sense in having the most clean energy resource, which is 100% safe and secure, and nobody can afford it. Energy prices are becoming an issue if they are too high. And this transition to drive to a CO2 less or CO2 free society with electrification is adding cost. And this has to be managed. Because I believe very strong, everybody is driving CO2 reduction down, everybody is in favor of sustainability as long as you can afford it. Very soon you're losing the political support if the price tag you pay, the monthly bill, is much too high, because then it's becoming very critical. And balancing these three things, security of supply, affordability, and sustainability, is a local challenge. There's not a single city, not a single utility, not a single area, state, or region who has the same kind of set of conditions and solutions. Yes, the technology is there to cope with that overall, not a problem. But the application, what we are doing in which area to make it affordable, secure, and sustainable is always a different one. And that requires, yes, digitalization, IT and OT. Yes, it requires innovation. Maybe there are some solutions we haven't invented yet, but I'm quite sure that we will. But first and foremost, it requires collaboration. Everything what we are doing in that space is affecting people, their daily life, their daily routine, their comfort of living, their price schedule, a price tag, and of course, a lot of stakeholders need to be convinced. I'm quite comfortable and convinced that we are able to tackle that challenge. To drive CO2 emissions down in our society is something what we have committed to and what we are able to do. I'm not saying it's an easy task. I'm not saying it can be done tomorrow. We have time, but the time frame and the cycles for these innovations and the implementations are something we have to look for. But we have to take everybody with us. We have to convince everybody that what we are doing is affordable and sustainable at the same time. And with that, I think we are having good discussions going forward in the next couple of days here at Climate Week and at this panel. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andreas. we're going to build on some of the themes Andreas introduced here around electrification, digitization, and collaboration in just a moment. But before we do, I would like to introduce our panelists here for the second portion of this session. Mary Deboisaki is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Cisco, and Simon Nanan is the SVP of Business Strategy at Hitachi Vantara. Please welcome them both to the stage.
Thank you.
Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we heard from Andreas some of the central themes of electrification and digitization. Some of the research that RMI has done independently is looking at the electricity demand forecasting over the next 10 years. And it's not going to surprise you. It's pretty dramatic. As much as 26% over the next 10 years, largely driven by this AI infrastructure, onshoring, and other domestic manufacturing, at least here in the US. You guys both work at technology-based companies, are largely listening and evaluating the demand signals, as well as trying to help your organizations navigate the path to climate alignment and sustainability. Simon, I'm going to start with you and just get your take on really how you guys, how you guys are navigating these complexities of both the demand signals that you're hearing from others, as well as the path to operating more sustainably.
Very good. Thank you, Josh. So just for everyone's context, I represent the strategy and sustainability functions within Hitachi Vantara. Hitachi Vantara is the data center storage and technology arm of the broader Hitachi company. So in that respect, one of the goals that we have is making sure that through data centers and through digital, we can unlock value for the rest of the company, but also for our customers at large. Digital to drive real-world outcomes. So that's the general focus of our work. Everyone's got a perspective on AI. My perspective on AI is AI can be a part of the problem, but AI can also be a part of the solution. You just characterized some of the problem really well, right? But I'll throw some stats out there. I'm sure everyone's aware of these things, but the data center footprint today itself accounts for more than the entire airline industry in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and in terms of energy usage. That number is expected to grow by 2.5x to 3x over the next 5 years and may actually reach 10% by 2030, and that's entirely driven or mostly driven by AI. It's things about AI, for example, a single ChatGPT query uses 100 times more resources than the average Google query. You run 10 million queries a day, and that's enough energy to power 33,000 US households. And if you put all of this together and actually say you want to train a large language model or an LLM, that's enough emissions equivalent to the lifetime of 5 American cars. That's a big problem. So what do we have to try to do to solve it, right? I think it is AI for good, responsible AI, and then some of the storage technologies that we bring to bear. Allow me to just dive into each of those for a quick second. I'll summarize it, but here's the thesis on AI. The whole value proposition of AI is a productivity value proposition. It is meant to save effort, time, dollars. It is meant to drive business benefit in a way that you're actually dramatically improving decision making. You apply that to any real world problem, and let's say, here's a real world problem of sustainability. The world is going to have a climate change problem, or the world has a climate change problem. Let's put AI to work to try to solve that problem. Can it do it? It can by taking many, many factors and variables and putting it together and saying, here's an outcome that we can drive, right? But you got to do it responsibly, because you got to do it in a way that somehow mitigates all the impacts. So when I talk about the business case or the value case of AI, sure, every company is trying to put a value case that says, here's the productivity benefit of AI, but what they're not accounting for is that cost gets transferred from here into some other bucket. You're saving cost over here, but where are you putting the cost? You're transferring it to the environment. Now you've got to figure out within AI how to optimize by We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, but green algorithms and green coding and green-friendly architectures for AI, data models, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that provides a little bit of an answer to the question, but from a data storage perspective, we are intent on making sure that the combination of what do customers want from storage? They got to solve business applications. They got to cater to what they need out of those applications, which is low latency, high throughput. It needs to be able to provide the output when they need it, but at the same time do it with high sustainability. High performance, high sustainability. How do you make those things work together? We actually think that not just companies like Hitachi Vantara can lead the way through the kind of technologies that we bring to bear by making sure that if you actually use Hitachi Vantara storage, you can reduce carbon footprint by 60% compared to the average or the normal deployment. That's not trivial, right? And if you are able to embed into these things green algorithms and green ways of working, now you got something that's really powerful. So hopefully that answers the question.
It does. Thank you, Simon. Mary, I'd love to get your take, and maybe just before you start, help the audience learn a little bit more about you and your responsibilities at Cisco.
Thank you so much, Mary Iwasaki. I am a New Yorker, so for those of you new to New York, welcome. And as the Chief Sustainability Officer, it really is a phenomenal role to think about, like, what do we do today, but also how do we envision tomorrow? Cisco, it's a worldwide technology company who I was kind of say that we securely connect everything to make anything possible. And when you start thinking about that from a sustainability perspective, one of the key things that we do is how do you really embed sustainability throughout the company? So part of our focus on not just sustainable but regenerative, our strategy is called the Plan for Possible because we know the solutions are available today. It's all about how we're accelerating the transition to cleaner energy, embedding circularity, supporting resilient ecosystems. I mean, we've all experienced over the last few years how dependent we are on those communities that we live, work, and play in. And a lot of this is underpinned by what I'd probably call like enhanced governance, because if you want to capture the opportunity of generative AI, how do you do it in a responsible way? How do you make sure that when you hear a claim made by someone at Cisco that you know it was validated by a subject matter expert, by legal, finance, our office as well? And it's fascinating. I think we've been investing in sustainability since the early 2000s, but in the last year, we've talked a lot about the opportunity of generative AI. And when you think about generative AI, I do think there's a huge possibility for it to create positive social change. But we do know we need to rethink the network. Right. And we also know it will require energy. So how do we really look at the challenges in front of us and really think through how do we embrace an AI-fueled, an AI intelligent society at the same time we're creating the environment to create that climate future we all want. And so one of the key things is not only making sure we hit our climate goals, which is net zero across our value chain by 2040, but it's helping our customers and our partners all in their sustainability journey as well. And so one of that is really thinking through this energy transition, working across the ecosystem collectively, not only to find out what we can do today to really support that transition, but how do we also invest in new technologies that we need to have available 2040 and beyond.
Yeah, great points. And I think you both highlight both the promise as well as the risks that AI represents. One of the opportunities that we see in the near term is the simplification and the ability to kind of take a large complex problem, make it very simple, often getting to actionable and specific results. One of those places that complexity loves to exist, it's been around for a long time, is Scope 3, our supply chain emissions. And for many companies, that represents well over 80% of their entire emissions profile. How are you guys thinking about supply chain decarbonization, whether it involves technology or not? I'd love to hear from both of you about steps you're taking and trends that you're seeing. Maybe let's start with you, Mary.
For those of you that talk in scopes, we are a Scope 3 company. the vast majority from Scope 3 Category 11, as well as our supply chain. So the first thing is understanding where you are, right? What is your current state? How are you calculating that carbon footprint? But as we think about working with our supply chain, it's really understanding not only where they are, how to build their capability, their capacity. I think one of the most important things that we've probably done in the last 2 years is invest in what I call a sustainable data foundation. The ability to start really capturing the data, wherever that may be. And for some of you, you probably know a lot of us probably use Excel spreadsheets to capture some of this information. So how do we get that information, start digitizing it, importantly putting in the controls that we know mandatory reporting is going to require. But as we digitize that, it really allows us not only to understand where we have the most refined data, but also really supports our scenario planning of where do we expect growth to happen, where will there be, what kind of energy will be available, where do we see our customers adopting renewables as well as our suppliers. So as I think about supply chain, one of the most important things is how do we collectively get at better and better meaningful data.
Yeah. How about you, Simon?
Well, this problem is obviously, it takes a village, right? Most companies, if you ask them and you say, okay, you got to comply with these reporting requirements and regulations, Scope 1 and 2, they've got a fairly clear idea on what they need to do. However hard it is to get there, they actually know this is a clear set of steps. When it comes to Scope 3, it's hairy, it's complex, and they really have, ask most people, they really don't know how to actually manage the impacts of that. Some of the companies, including in our space, in the data center space, including the hyperscalers, found that because of the impacts that they're having, they are 30% off higher than the baseline that was set in 2020. That's a problem. We're going in the opposite direction instead of reducing it, right? So I think I completely agree with Mary. Data is the key. Data visibility, data integration is the key. I have used the term in the past, sussed ops. Let me explain, right? The tech industry loves this kind of terminology, but we moved from DevOps 20 years ago. It became DevSecOps because security started to get embedded everywhere. And then it became FinOps because now you're managing financials and costs, and you're basically saying, help me make the right trade-off decisions in terms of cost, regardless of where my assets are deployed. The next rev is green ops, carbon ops, sussed ops, call it what you will, but it's basically saying you've added a dimension to your decision making. Yeah. You basically said, it's not either or, it's not security or financials or sustainability. Even when you're trading these things off against each other, guess who can help you make those trade-offs? AI, right? You collect the data, integrate the data. It's easier said than done. Translate them from spreadsheets into tools, but when they come into a system, you're able to potentially make recommendations. And just imagine a world where a couple of years from now, you can tweak up a dial through a simulation and basically say, what if I was to do this? And run such scenarios and say, that's the impact on your cost, and this is the impact on your carbon, and this is the impact on your top line and bottom line. It'll be fantastic, right? That's, I think, what we're all prioritizing and aiming for.
Yeah. On the note of prioritization, I think it's very clear that AI has the potential to help us prioritize better. What it can't necessarily do is build the meaningful relationships we need, especially when it comes to decarbonizing our supply chains. I'm wondering if you could just build on kind of the theme of collaboration. What are some of those ways in which you're working with some of your suppliers that is leading to breakthrough results or exciting outcomes?
What's really interesting when I think about sustainability, and when you're in a corporate environment and you build a strategy, at least back when I was much, much younger, you would build a strategy and make this is my competitive differentiation. When you start thinking about sustainability, this is an area that we want to share what's worked, right, what hasn't worked, what is best practices. I think it's the beauty of greenhouse gas carbon accounting is it creates the interdependency. So this is an area where I'm seeing really interesting partnerships. And one of the first things that I'm seeing happen is whether it's a partner or someone in our supply chain coming and saying, you know what, we both have the same net zero goal. Yeah. How are we going to get there together? So then we really sit down, share our methodology, start trying to forecast not only what that end customer might need, but what does that mean all the way back? Where do we see our innovation in terms of our product development? How are we continuing to refine our circular design principles to make sure that we're thinking, of course, about energy efficiency, but more modularity, more use of remanufacture or more recycled material. So what I'm seeing is more of this, I guess, co-scenario planning of where are we and what do we need to do, which leads us to whether it's collective action or we can co-invest. When you think about where we live, work, and create, where our suppliers are, we overlap. And the ability for us to come together and co-invest is critical for not only the energy transition, but just to create resilient communities.
Yeah, I'll build on a couple of things that you said there, Mary. So, electric car manufacturer that we shall not name decided one day to put the IP online and make it open and available to everyone. And it was kind of a remarkable, bold move, but it was meant at basically saying everyone benefits when information is shared like that. That's critical information that is beneficial to the planet. And I think that, to Mary's point exactly, sharing of information, but also participation in standards, especially when you start integrating up and down the value chain. If every company is left to its own devices, it's chaos, and that's kind of the challenge, the complexity that we're dealing with right now. Regulation helps a little bit, right? For example, the CSRD and EU nomenclature, and for example, all of that puts in place certain things that you say, okay, if everyone's capturing this information, at least these are the standards that we can exchange. But we need more of that. However painful regulation is, we need to be able to share information so that we can work together. I'll add one more point, which is, I think you talked about co-invest, and it implies the idea of co-innovation, or as Hitachi calls it, co-creation. For us, that is actually basically saying, with our ecosystem, these are things that we do together, not just in, hey, we got to collect data together, we got to make it seamless and integrate it together, but there are ideas in which when you bring your ideas to the table and we bring our ideas to the table and we find out in the middle what the need really is and the kinds of solutions that can meet those needs, we find a new kind of innovation, coming up, right? And for us, that's very exciting. That's actually the entirety of our business model. Our business model is co-innovate with customers. So in this case, sustainability is a top 3 priority. And in that context, it's a top 3 priority, not just for checking the box, but for innovation, new products, new solutions, new offerings. I'm optimistic. I see the challenge that's ahead, but I also see the opportunity. Yeah.
I am too. And one of the things that you mentioned, and I'd love to pick up on here, is the issue of business model innovation. We've talked about technology innovation, and so much is going on in the AI space. Business model innovation often gets less attention, but is often critical to getting to some of these sustainability outcomes. It's part and parcel to how we collaborate. It creates shared value with like-minded organizations who are trying to meet the same climate target. How are you guys thinking about, and where have you seen kind of business model innovation, especially in how you deliver your hardware, your services to some of your customers and partners?
I think you will always see some really interesting business model and value creation. I remember the day where if you had technology, it had to be on-prem, somewhere in some closet someplace. And then as you start moving to cloud or hybrid cloud or hardware as a service is an interesting concept. And then sometimes I think about it from the sustainability lens, right? So if you have hardware as a service type of solution, that also creates different kind of responsibilities and roles of not only providing that business outcome in the most secure way, but also what does that mean in terms of that sustainability journey. I do think there's more opportunities to really start grappling with, when we really think a low carbon economy, what does that look like? And how does a private sector entity not only report out traditional financials, but others as well? I think on the circular side, this is a really interesting area that many of us are really looking at is, well, what is that business model? Underpinned by what we think is a very dynamic regulatory environment as well. And so when you think about that in terms of, as a product manager, as I'm building this product and thinking about, well, how do I design for customer 1, customer 2, and maybe more. And what does that look like? And how do you generate value across that period of time? So I think that circular side is going to be an interesting area. This is, again, where we're going to work very closely with many of our customers and partners who not only feel it's critical, but we are seeing in certain locations, certain countries, that some of the regulations are going to really push the envelope on the business model. I think on the innovation side, even this is where I think some interesting partnerships, but on the innovation side, the ability for us to make sure there's enough capital, that kind of patient capital we need today for the technologies we have to have in 2040 and 50. That to me is an area where I'm finding really interesting ideas. Often, right, pulling the best of each other, but it also allows us to take a little bit more long term.
What's really interesting about that is we've often complained, everyone complains about how the stock market incentivizes short-term behavior, right? You're just planning quarter to quarter to quarter. I think this particular lever puts us in a different position because suddenly now organizations are dealing with 2030, 2040, 2050 goals, carbon neutrality or net zero, and you're basically doing the math and saying, if this has to work out, I've got to cut 4% every year. And so it's no longer, you're merging the short term with the long term, which I think is really powerful. And it is changing the way businesses think and operate. But to your point also, it forces us into a different kind of model for innovation because incubation is no longer a nice to have thing that happens in a pocket somewhere, right? It gets more integrated with how the business works. Coming to the point on as a service, which you talked about, I think basically related to the idea of outcomes and consumption, you're basically saying we're finding this more and more in the storage world, the data center storage world, but you can elevate this to the level of the overall infrastructure in the data center, which is like storage and compute and network, then raise it a level higher, which is basically entire DC operations, right? And how you optimize across that. What we're finding the shift to is a shift to outcomes. So when we sign a deal with customers, it's no longer the traditional CapEx deal of like sell a box, right? And monetize it immediately and then just get service over the years. We're actually selling outcomes and SLAs. So for example, SLAs would be in the contract. It could be either an SLA or an SLO, but you've got in there that there will be this much availability, there will be this much reliability, there will be this much cost savings, but there will also be this much, electricity, power consumption reduction, year-on-year improvement. That's pretty radical.
And,
right?
and that kind of outcome, like what that does to your relationship with your customer.
That's correct.
The proximity you have to have with your customer to understand the trust, that open dialogue is critical.
This is not devise a contract in some room, ship it over the wall and say sign on the dotted line. This is actually you both being in the room together to come up with what is the customer's business goal and how can we work towards solving that in an SLA-driven fashion. So the entire commercial model is changing. It is complex because there's a bigger problem that there's not enough IT skills to go around. There's not enough of this kind of as a service or OpEx-based financial. These are hard things to find, right? So at the same time, I think we're trying to solve for multiple problems. It's a hard thing, but one thing that still encourages me is there is awareness or realization of the problem, not just at the office of the CEO and his directs, but in every function. It is impacting them in some way or the other. So all of them see the part that they have to play in responding to it. Yeah.
If outcome-based results and strategic collaboration is fundamental to how you're engaging certain parts of your value chain, how about the other parts of the value chain, which requires more patience, more capacity planning, more equity, frankly? How are you guys thinking about sort of the broader long tail of the value chain that is maybe just as critical, but harder to engage in sort of a one-to-one type capacity?
No, you're right. We have to maintain a level of internal complexity to be able to handle that. Recently, in our company, we were trying to do the math across a very large supplier base because we are trying to set a very clear net zero goal that's fairly aggressive, but everyone needs to play ball if we need to get there. And so For us, it is about working through some of that long tail. The larger ones are the more critical ones. We've got to make decisions sooner rather than later. We can't be sitting on them. And if they're the kind of company that is a legacy company and more intractable, and they've not formed their own goals, it puts us in a hard position of basically having to make a difficult choice to say, who are the people we want to partner with?
And that is something you're seeing. When we look at, let's say, our top 50 hardware companies, you're starting to see in that contractual relationship requirements around sustainability goals. So I do think sometimes I think about regulations and incentives or requirements and capacity building that you're starting to realize, and this is where probably one of the first things I do when I meet with a customer or a partner or a supplier is I look at what is their net zero goal or how soon is it? And all of a sudden, the sooner that date is, you can start understanding I'm going to get a certain type of behavior. So as you start seeing it very close, right, we have our near term scope 1 and 2, 90% absolute reduction is at the end of this fiscal year for us. So I'm telling you, we are counting every carbon. So when you start working with certain customers, partners, suppliers that have goals around 2025, 2030, 2040, in the beginning, you're doing those things that are easier, power purchase agreements or different things. But as you get close, this is where not only some of the process change, the behavior change, and the ability for us to start understanding, sharing the practice. I think one of the biggest questions I sometimes get is, well, what are your actions? What are your levers? How are you doing it? How are you convincing all the stakeholders within the company? How are you financing it? All of that information can be provided across the entire value chain. And probably more importantly, to all of those even small and medium businesses in the community.
Right. Mary, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question, and with our remaining time, I'll give it to Simon to try and close us out here. You mentioned something earlier, Mary, about sort of really ensuring that there is objectivity in how we determine performance-based results. And this is a question that we get a lot at RMI is, as we all strive to do the right thing, how do we ensure that the right thing is performance-based and objective and not subject to greenwashing and whatnot? How do you navigate that complex path when there isn't always the milestones and the guideposts to inform your direction?
Well, I'd probably say one of the most critical elements of building trust is transparency. Yeah. Transparency in the data, transparency in your assumptions, in your hypothesis. So I do think one of the key things is, reporting out, whether it is your annual purpose report or your impact report. It's also using some external organizations like CDP and others where you can provide that information. But I think as we are really turning the corner, we've got to think about our climate data just the same way we do with our financials, which means that you understand who owns that data. You actually have a strategy and a taxonomy, that there is a company-wide agreement on how you're collecting this information. You're putting the controls in place, and you're auditing it, that you're actually taking it through with people checking the math, the process. And I think one of the other things is being completely transparent about your confidence. As we look at some of, let's say, Scope 3 data, it is based on spend. So, or even when I look at, sometimes I'm doing, let's say, a life cycle assessment, or I'm trying to understand, well, where is this particular product? The ability for me to be very transparent in the method, the calculations, the confidence, and how we're refining it over time is critical.
Any reflections on transparency and the role, the leadership role you guys get to play before you wrap us up?
Yeah, no, I think Mary said that really well. Governance, executive sponsorship, and buy-in is so critical. That's what essentially cascades down. The organization can see if it's lip service, right? Or if it is treated as a nice to have or a vanity project, right? It's very easy for something like this because it's been embedded, I guess, in our culture to look at it that way. But right now, I think more and more people are realizing the importance of doing this. So your chief product officer has to have very clear goals around what he wants to achieve, and that's got to cascade down. It's not just your risk officer. It's not just your financial officer. It's also, to your point, on strategy. It's to your point on business operations and IT. Every function needs to understand the translation to them and then set their own goals. The leader potentially needs to have an MBO attached to it, right? Mary said have requirements and incentives, or carrots and sticks, if you want to put it that way, right? Both things need to come to bear to be able to make this work. I think our organization, I'm proud of what Hitachi is doing, and Hitachi Vantara in particular, in constantly reinforcing this is important, this is important. So it resonates with the organization. At some point it sinks in to say, you know what, it's not just words, we're putting our money where our mouth is, and so that always lands well.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, this has been an enlightening discussion for me. Thank you both for the time. Simon, maybe you can just bring us home with some observable themes and closing remarks.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. All right. And of course, I think Andreas is not here, but you heard a very enlightening session from him as well, so thanks to him. Thank you all for attending. I'll just add a small reflection. I've been with Hitachi not that long. I've been with Hitachi for the last 5 years. And one of the things that I learned when I joined Hitachi was this process of forecasting and backcasting. Now, the way it works is this. Hitachi looks at what are the biggest problems that the world is going to be facing 50 years from now. You can name them. It's climate change. It is rapid urbanization. It's an aging demographic. It's geopolitical instability. We're running out of natural resources. You put these things together, and now Hitachi asks the question, what are the things that we need to do as a society and as businesses to be able to make sure that we're ready for those changes and we can proactively handle it? It's long-term thinking, but because of that, Hitachi then frames its businesses around those goals. It's not saying we're in any business to be able to maximize our bottom line. Hitachi uses the term double bottom line, which basically says, apart from your revenue and your profit, you have something that is not reflected in purely financial terms, that is basically your impact to your customers, your partners, your shareholders, society, and the planet at large. For me, that double bottom line concept has become so important and so inspirational that I feel like it's a prompt for everyone to think that way, right? So I'll share a few thoughts in closing. Sustainability is more than a buzzword, and it's more than a compliance checkbox. And as we work with our customers, our partners, and our ecosystem, we need to make sure that sustainability is central to our core strategies, that it's driving innovation and value, and that it enhances the quality of life of current and future generations. It's about time. Innovation can be a path to a better future. We talked about some of the innovation examples that we have, right? But I like it when innovation starts to cross boundaries. A good example, and I'm sure Andreas brought some examples up as well, but we had a customer, I'm just going to use the example of a customer in Brazil who, they were an existing customer of Hitachi Energy, so they used our power solutions. But what they realized that when they work with us, they can also get a data solution that is customized for their needs. You combine data and power together, and now you have the smart grid and the ability to actually optimize outcomes between these two things. That's what the data center needs. That's what AI needs. And there's several other examples of where you bring data to bear and data is creating real world outcomes. I said it earlier, and let me repeat it, right? Sustainability is more than a buzzword. It needs to be a top 3 business priority. It's time for us at Hitachi. It's been in our DNA. It's the corner of our business for many years, and will continue to be that way going forward. If you want to hear more, there's a good session tomorrow at 9:45 a.m. The title of the session is AI is Coming. Can technology change the trajectory of climate change? I guess very much on the lines of what we talked about today. It's got a very esteemed panel. So Nitesh Banga, who's a good friend and the CEO of Global Logic, he will be here, as well as executives from Nokia and Meta. So please do not miss that. And as I wrap up, I just want to add, today has been great. I've loved seeing the energy, not just around the place, but even in this room. I'm encouraged by the roles and the commitments that we have discussed very openly. And I truly believe in what we can achieve together with focus, commitment, big ambitions and creative co-innovation, we can advance the cause of a greener planet and sustainable business together. It's time. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.